people refuse to hand over, or the Jews to the Germans by lying on train tracks, by not working, by non-cooperation. But at the same time, we must remember there are distinct differences in how people respond to different situations. And of course, if people are being massacred by mass genocide, it's irresponsible, I think, not to respond, if our government's not to respond. So I think there's two different ways which we can respond, individually, collectively as a community, and all how people respond also governmentally. And just a question is that, what should a Christian response be to somebody like Mugabe who won't go?
Well, I mean, I think that the international community does need to be putting considerable pressure upon Mugabe, and certainly South Africa has a major role in this. Whether I would want to justify military intervention, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to follow up, I suppose, on what this woman here said. And perhaps I'd preface my remark by saying that I'm sorry to hear that nobody at this church in Ontario was able to say that what you said was unbiblical. I would actually make the case that what you say is unbiblical in a certain sense. And that is that what the New Testament as well as the Old Testament say is written for the people of God as the people of God. Whereas, and everything you say, I would, on that, I would affirm, and I'm grateful, for that matter, for the insight that you give on Romans 12 and the relationship between Romans 12 and Romans 13. But going again to the issue of whether the responsibility of the government is different from the responsibility of individuals, this, of course, is a very major theme in Christian social thought that you haven't addressed here. And then, of course, much of this is based on Romans 13 and the authority that God has given to government in wielding the sword, which he does not give to individuals. And Jesus said, of course, yes, we turn the other cheek, we overcome evil with good. But a government does have the power of the sword, and it's supposed to institute a certain sort of justice on that basis. Now, as you point out, this is tied up with a great deal of self-justification and ideology and idolatry as to that the state appropriates to itself. And this, of course, as Christians, we must reject. And we must reject any glorification of the state in the way that Rome glorified itself. Certainly that applies. Okay. Well, it is largely a comment rather than a question, which is to say that I don't think you've addressed the limitations of your point of view on what governments are and what governments are supposed to do. And I think it would be appropriate to acknowledge that there are limitations to what you say for the role of government.
Right. Well, we've begun to offer, and we will offer in greater depth when we get to writing this book, an alternative reading of Romans 13. And it seems to us that Romans 13 is been used ideologically, and you acknowledge that. We think that Romans 13 has been misread to be a blessing on the empire that we don't think it is. We think that really what Romans 13 is saying to the Christian community in Rome is, be careful. We think it's saying, be careful. It's not trying to say all the authority gives to them. I mean, even that language, they get to wield the sword, even though they themselves are saying, we don't have to wield a sword. We rule by reason. And Paul says, well, don't believe that for a second. Watch out for the sword. But I think the question is, watch out for the sword. And we have a website, not Sylvia and I, but my campus ministry, called Empire Remixed. And in this website that I do with a group of students, you can find another take on this in a blog that I have there, and it is called, excuse my language, To Hell with Romans 13, which doesn't mean to hell with the text. It means to hell with a certain reading of Romans 13. And one of the things I argue there is I'm very, very sick of hearing Romans 13 quoted out of context of Romans 12, out of context of all of Romans, out of context of the life of Jesus, out of context with the prophetic tradition. That this text gets pulled out, and I'm having a hard time seeing how this text is used in any way other than ideological. It's getting hot, folks.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on your point about loving your enemies. As someone who works with the casualties of the empire on a daily basis, those who have fled persecution and exile, I never get a sense of them wanting revenge or wanting to wield the sword. They're looking for redeemed lives. They want their lives restored. And I was very struck by a colleague of mine from the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture the other day, who's not a Christian, but she's worked for nearly 20 years with child soldiers and young people. And I was really struck when she said, I've never known a former child soldier who wasn't a pacifist. So these are people who know the sword, who have lived in that kind of conflict, and they know at some level that the answer is not to pick up the sword again.
You didn't cut her off and tell her to ask a question, mate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
A little favoritism here. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Just wanted to ask you first of all that we don't live in a time of swords now. We live in a nuclear age, right? And keeping in mind the Middle East conflict and the growing power, nuclear power of Iran, what would you suggest to Barack Obama or George Bush, what their Christian response should be?
That's a good question. Mind your own business. No, not to you, but to them. There's this interesting American sense that the United States is called to be a force for change and for good in the world. Most recently, that change for good has been through military interventions. And sometimes when we're speaking in the States, we're struck by this sense that the United States needs to go and do the dramatic thing. Now, the reality is that the United States is the most powerful nation in the world right now, and so needs to have a sense of how to use that power for good. Sometimes one of the things we talk about is the United States is also a place of incredible disparity. And you just need to go down to inner city Detroit or Chicago or New York. They've cleaned up a little bit, but Baltimore, Philadelphia, to see that the United States needs to, I think, clean up its own house before trotting grandly around the world to clean up other people's messes. So that would be one thing I would want to say to Barack Obama is you have tremendous suffering inside this country of yours. And what would it look like to mobilize the amount of budgetary funding that goes to the Army to actually alleviating the suffering in the midst of your cities? What would that look like? But then also, and I guess part of my problem is answering the question is the New Testament was written from below. The New Testament was written by people who had absolutely no power. And therefore, what the New Testament talks about is creating transformed communities on the ground that work in local places with local people to bring healing and redemption in the places of deep darkness, not over there, but exactly where you are. And so part of me thinks that Christians do need to be saying political things about what government should do, but their words would have a lot more credibility if we were actually looking around us on the bus, looking around us on the tube, looking around us at the people who live just a few streets over or a few states over, and we're actually doing something for those people. And then we would have the credibility maybe to start saying, oh, and by the way, you guys up at the top, here's what you should be doing as well. So I think we're in a tough situation because as soon as Christianity became powerful, it became empire.